Okay, let's do this. Sup, buckaroos? This is the third episode in a running series where I cover and adapt the Genshin Impact timeline as seen on the wiki page. If you want to see the other two episodes on everything pre-Archon War that was available at the time, and everything during the Archon War on Mondstadt and Liyue, I have a playlist linked in the description with those other two videos. For this episode, I am reluctantly covering Inazuma, a nation I have been rather vocal about not liking. The story of this nation is one that I'm not a huge fan of because there really isn't a whole lot to talk about, and half of the nation's story is Enkanomiya, which I just don't feel like that should be the case. I feel like Inazuma should be able to stand out alone. But I still feel like I should get this video out of the way before I dive into Sumeru. So, as one last goodbye to this awful filler nation, let's get into it. So pre-Archon War Inazuma is extremely vague and hard to pin down, even harder than Liyue or Mondstadt. The most we know about Inazuma is the fact that it was probably a larger landmass, not islands and archipelagos, but one singular landmass, mostly made up of sand. Back then, there was a foolish ruler, that's the most we know about him, who wanted to build a kingdom on the sand worshipping a white sacred tree, which is probably an Irminsul. But soon, for some reason, a flood came and washes the majority of this landmass away, leaving behind the Inazuma archipelago, save Watatsumi Island, because that was made later. One thing I would like to point out before we actually go on talking about Enkanomiya, in the flavor text of the Violet Court domain, it says, sometime in the ancient past, the mountains rose higher than the skies and the eagle was larger than the heaven's dome. I want to see this in Chinese, a more direct translation of this in Chinese, but this is stupidly straightforward and almost confirms the idea that Teyvat is in a Gnostic bubble / dome, but on the other hand, maybe not. I don't know. Okay, so that's the most we can glean from really early Inazuma. But while all of this is going on, you know what was going on that's way more well documented? That's right, our favorite extra region, Enkanomiya. So while Inazuma is busy being a large landmass of sand and not much else, Enkanomiya has been kicking it for quite a long time actually. They actually have been kicking it for so long, they've existed since before Celestia showed up and asserted dominance on the land. In fact, Enkanomiya was a part of the civilization of humans that had existed united across all of Teyvat for a very long time. This is called the One Civilization or the Unified Civilization. Another example of the civilization is the Upside Down City in the Chasm. When this unified civilization existed, Celestia hadn't quite arrived yet. Instead, the world was ruled by the dragon sovereigns, one for each element. It's not quite clear if the humans lived under the dragons or if they lived alongside them, but they existed at the same time nonetheless. So the dragon sovereigns ruled the world, and one of the settlements of the unified civilization was off the coast of what we now call Inazuma. They were just chilling and having a great time until war broke out, as is the nature of Teyvat. This war being described as a great war, although I have a feeling that it is very much lacking in trenches. This war was so great that it somehow split the earth open, allowing Enka to sink into the sea. The theory is that this is a sort of banishment for something that Enka did, but it's not clear. Luckily, Enkanomiya ends up not being swallowed and entombed in the earth, and instead they end up into this vast cave system underneath the ocean. So life for them can continue as normal with some divine stroke of luck, except this time it's just much darker. But their luck doesn't go entirely unnoticed because the Dragon Sovereigns notice that where Enkanomiya ended up is actually a really good spot for exiling their own members. Once you are forced into Enkanomiya caves, it's really hard to get out. So the Sovereigns start sending some of their criminals there under exile, which is good for the Sovereigns and Vishap society, but isn't great for the humans that are down there just trying their best to survive in this underground cavern, because these Vishaps really like how human meat tastes. Somehow though, the humans figure out that light scared away these Vishaps, so they start using whatever little light they had to scare the Vishaps away. They didn't really have enough to completely defend themselves, but they had enough to survive at the very least. After the people of Enkanomiya come to terms with their shit situation, being trapped underneath the ground, under the sea, sealed alongside a bunch of dragons that were so evil they were exiled from their own civilization above the ground, that really like the taste of humans, a hero of sorts rises to the challenge. His name is Abrax, whatever. And he comes up with the idea to create an artificial sun to permanently ward off the Vishaps. He calls it Helios, and it is later translated into Inazuman language as the Dainichi Mikoshi. This artificial sun was capable of creating both enough light to scare off the Vishaps, as well as mimicking the day-night cycle of the service, allowing for the humans to actually have a circadian rhythm instead of just sleeping whenever they were tired. This made Abrax a hero of the people of Enkanomiya and allowed them to build their civilization again. So fast forward a few years, and this cabal of leaders pretty much turn the Helios into a deity. They start worshipping it as a god and pretty much create a cult around it, or a religion, whatever you choose. They appoint these people, who they dub the Sun Children, to pretty much be the Helios' prophets, or like touched by the Helios or whatever. These Sun Children rule the land, which is to say they are puppet leaders of the corrupt cabal. But here's the thing. The Sun Children were not just some random people. They were actually children that the elders abused and pretty much brainwashed into thinking they were holy and cool, and made everybody think that the Sun Children were in charge, when in reality the elders were in charge. And the elders realized that this plan of using children as puppets to rule Enka only works as long as their puppets are actually children. So they decide, you know, instead of changing our plan, let's like quote unquote sacrifice the children to the Helios and call it necessary. So that's exactly what they did. It's kind of fucked up. Okay, so I think right here is where we should pause and stop with the whole Enkanomiya summary, because soon after that, Enka's history gets really mixed into Inazuma's history real fast. So let's rewind back to the start of Enka's history, and instead of following Enka, let's follow the above ground the entire time instead. So a while ago, we talked about Enkanomiya, which was not Enkanomiya at that point, but it was called like Byakuyokoku or whatever, but I just call it Enkanomiya. We talked about them sinking into the sea for one reason or another, and in the same time frame, Inazuma actually turned into an archipelago proper. After these islands are formed, the Tanuki, these little fuckers, eventually emerge through evolution, of all things. They have this beautiful place to call their own, so they just party it the fuck up. Drinking sake, blasting some music, doing a line of coke off a suspiciously yellow toilet seat, stuff like that. The partying doesn't go on for too long, however, because the Kitsune appear at the shore of Inazuma and do a good ol' manifest destiny on the Tanuki. The Tanuki, of course, really don't like this and decide to fight against the Kitsune's colonization, thus sparking war. So the Kitsune and Tanuki go at it for a while, around 800 years, pause briefly to take a breather, and then go at it for another 800 years. The war ends up lasting 1600 years, with it ending up in a stalemate in a peace agreement. So an interesting thing is the book in which this story comes from, Tokiali Tales, goes on to say that the war is the reason humans came to exist. It's because like the strategy for the war was like shape-shifting and switcheroos and trickery or something, which really got confusing really quick. So some creatures got so confused as to who was who that they got confused about their own identities, thus becoming humans, or something along those lines. It's confusingly worded, but I think that's what it's trying to say. So I want to point this out because this is very clearly not the case unless we're expecting humans to evolve in the exact same way twice over on two different landmasses, or that they evolved on Inazuma and then migrated over to mainland Teyvat. We don't actually know how humans got to Inazuma if this is completely false. I honestly think that Celestia just like dragged and dropped people onto Inazuma like you're playing Black and White 2, but that's just me. Around the time of the Tanuki Kitsune War, the Tsurumi Island happened. I already covered what happened there in another timeline video. I'm too lazy to do it again here. I said it in the most basic of terms because I covered it before Tsurumi Island even was available to play, but I'm still going to make you watch that section of the video because it's super cool that we got the Tsurumi Island story before we actually knew it was Tsurumi Island. So one last thing to cover here is that even though the Tanuki Kitsune War ended in a stalemate and a truce, the Tanuki refused to admit that they didn't win and kept pouting about it. Even through their pouting, however, they decided to give the sacred Sakura, once under their domain, to the Kitsune. Why this was done is rather unclear, but it happened and is very important to modern-day Inazuma. Okay, so now that the Tanuki and Kitsune have made a truce, and now that the elders in Inka are killing children, it's looking like a pretty good time to launch into the Inazuma section of the Archon War. The time between the Tanuki Kitsune War and the Archon War is unclear, and it could be a very large amount of time, but whatever. Either way, there is an amount of time where, probably, the twin gods, Baal and Beelzebul, are created/born. We have zero idea where they came from, really, and it's an interesting gap in time that goes completely undocumented. We have mention of a war, and then boom, next thing we know, A and Makoto are wrecking shop on the battlefield. So now that A and Makoto actually exists, let's get to know our twin sisters of battle. On the left side, we have A, the extremely skilled fighter who is completely unstoppable when given a good sword to wield. On the right, we have Makoto, who is also extremely skilled in battle, but is no match for her sister. Instead, Makoto is much more powerful in will and leadership. For this reason, when A and Makoto are eventually the only people left in the war, A concedes the Gnosis to Makoto, as she believes that Makoto would be a much better Archon. Sidebar, and a really long sidebar, this point is the subject of a huge lore discrepancy. So in one of Yae Miko's lines, she says that A and Makoto won the war together and that A decided that Makoto was a better fit for the Archon role and gave it to her. But in Treasured Tales of the, I'm not going to even try to pronounce that, it states that lost against Makoto, and Makoto was given the role of Archon because of that. But what's so weird about this is the fact that either way, something doesn't add up. If we go by Yai's interpretation, then that breaks the general precedent that the Archon War was a last man standing whole kind of deal, and that for some reason, A and Makoto were able to choose who ascended. But if we go with the Treasured Tales story, that means that one way or another, A is dead? Which, like, no? Yes, when gods die, they don't stop existing in Teyvat. That's been established. The wiki states that it's probably something similar to how Andreas sacrificed himself so Barbatos could rise to the throne, because the Archon War is a last man standing kind of thing. And Andreas still exists in Teyvat, but there's a fundamental difference between how Andreas interacts with the world and how A, who later become an Archon herself, interacts with Teyvat. So I'm gonna go against what the wiki says here and say that Makoto and A got an exception somehow from Celestia or something, and they got to choose who got the Gnosis, in this case being Makoto, who became the god of transience. So while the Archon War is ranging up above ground on Inazuma proper, Enkanomiya is still kind of suffering under the rule of the Sun Children. At some point during the Archon War, Orobashi, a serpent god thing, flees from somewhere in Inazuma, presumably from the Archon War, and finds Enkanomiya. At some point, the binds that kept Enkanomiya completely separate from the rest of the world happened to be weaker than usual at this point in time, so Orobashi just kind of slips in. It doesn't necessarily interfere immediately with Enkanomiya though. Instead, it just hides in what is known now as the Serpent's Bowels. And it isn't until a random kid found it and asked it to help overthrow the tyrannical rule of a cabal of puppet masters. Gavroche looking ass. Orobashi agrees to this for some reason, and they overthrow the rule of the Sun Children, leaving Enkanomiya free, and the people promote Orobashi from some random serpent thing to Watatsumi Umakami, or the great god of the oceans. So, under the rule of Orobashi, the civilization of Enkanomiya underwent some major changes. Orobashi decided to try and bring the people up to date on Inazuman culture, teaching them the language and the culture of the land above. He also helped with ongoing research on the Vishaps, which they had started at that point, helping the people understand them. This research ended up creating Vishaps that were bigger, stronger, and could deal with the modern versions of elements that Celestia brought with them much better. So Enkanomiya was prospering more than it ever had, and it was looking like it was going to stay that way until somehow Orobashi came across a record of the world before Enkanomiya sank under the ground. This, as we now know it, is before Sun and Moon. This text revealed the truth of Phanes, Celestia, and the land that created the Vishaps, and why the Vishaps didn't meld well with the elemental energy of Orobashi. Orobashi tried to keep this close to its chest, if it has a chest, but Celestia somehow still found out that it and Enkanomiya had this record. Celestia, being Celestia, decided that Orobashi knowing this information was far too dangerous for one reason or another, and decided to give it a choice. Either die now and wipe this information off of Teyvat, or continue living and let it and its people be obliterated here and now. This obliteration option is probably what we now know as Celestial Nails, the thing that destroyed Salvindingnir and the Chasm civilization. Orobashi decides that it would rather not get smitten by a massive chunk of Celestia, and that it would be taking the death route, but not before it can give a better life for its people. Using the power of the Dainichi Mikoshi, Orobashi opens a way to the surface for its people, and it starts their migration to the surface. While the people of Enkanomiya are leaving, the scholars have a debate as to what to do with the forbidden knowledge, and they eventually decide that they would keep it in this world, but hide it behind various trials and puzzles for somebody to find. These trials were designed so that only those that would be worthy enough to bear this knowledge and would be able to resist against Celestia's eventual censorship would be able to complete the trials and obtain the knowledge. Before they could actually set the trials in place, however, some dickwads from Khaenri'ah tried to come and steal the forbidden knowledge. They were unsuccessful, and the scholars in Enkanomiya were able to seal the knowledge away. And after that was said and done, Orobashi ascended everybody to an island that it had created above the ground, which was to be named Watatsumi Island. Watatsumi was, as the people were soon to learn, not very good for living. After all, an island created practically out of the dandruff of a giant snake god isn't the most fertile thing for growing crops. And so this faced the people of Watatsumi, who now called themselves the Sangonomiya clan, with a problem. Orobashi decided that, in one last hoorah, it would lead an army to invade their neighbors, Narukami Island. At first it was only a plea and a migration, but eventually it started to escalate and it looked like a war would start to break out. While this escalation is slowly happening, A, not Makoto, notices what's happening out in Narukami Island. So A and a few of her comrades, most notably Tengo Sasayuri, who we see in A's Nightmare trailer, set out to Narukami to prevent this war from happening. When they got there, they found out that they were too late and war had already fully broken out. A and her friends jump right into the fighting. Eventually, Tengo Sasayuri is slain, which made A very much not happy. She proceeded to smite Orobashi into oblivion with her famous Miso no Hitotachi, killing Orobashi on the spot. Something to point out is that Orobashi did not have to participate in this war, but he was on the front lines just as much as A was, so the question is why? The most likely explanation is that because of what Orobashi found, Celestia had deemed both it and all of its people on multiple accounts of profanity in deceiving living souls, whatever that means. Orobashi was given the choice to take on all of the transgressions of both itself and its people, and to let Celestia rule over its people again. To do this, it had to be slain, and it ended up being A that did the deed. But as we said before, because gods in Genshin don't really die, they just change forms, and they can still affect the world after death. Orobashi's slaying created a curse known as Tatarigami. Tatarigami caused Yashiori Island, the location of Orobashi's death, to be riddled with sickness, calamity, storms, and many other unpleasant things. To combat this, A places a bunch of Narukami pillars across the island to help suppress the force of the Tatarigami. It only works somewhat. It's unclear if Orobashi dying marks the end of the Archon War in Inazuma, or if the Archon War had already ended and it dying was just kind of an addendum. But either way, Orobashi is dead now, and Inazuma has an extremely passionate and loving Raiden Shogun that rules over them, and everyone is happy. Really, the only notable thing that happens in Inazuma during this time of peace is that Yaemiko is born, and has been born long enough to grow up and decide to move to live at the Sacred Sakura because she admires the Kitsune Saigu so much that she wanted to be her personal assistant or something, I don't know. In the years that led up to the Cataclysm, there's a bunch of stuff that happens to a bunch of random historical figures that I'm not going to cover. This is one of the reasons why I don't like Inazuma lore so much. It's just a lot of random people. Go read the wiki page for yourself if you're really interested, but in general, people live, people die, and that's really about it. The only thing of note here is that the book Chronicles of the Six Kitsune has two versions, actually. The original and a newer one written by a different author who took a chapter out of Nintendo's book and titled their version of the book New Chronicles of the Six Kitsune. The author of the original book, Yuri Kusai, did something that pissed off the Kitsune Saigu to a point where he had to flee from Inazuma. What this is still kind of unclear, however, it's possible that whatever he did is related to the Abyss invading Teyvat, and it may have made Inazuma a target. In response to this thing that Yuri Kusai did, the Kitsune Saigu moves from Narukami's shrine to Tenshukaku to prepare for the impending invasion. Everybody else in Electro Archon Corp is also getting ready to go to war, which includes the Raiden sisters. Before the Cataclysm actually takes place, the Thunder Sakura are planted across Narukami Island. One of the Raiden sisters took some branches off the Sacred Sakura and planted them across the island and are imbued with their Electro Spirit. Whether it was A or Makoto that did this is unclear, but once this was done, they split ways, with Makoto following her contractual obligations as Archon and serve it under Celestia probably to go fight at Conria, and Raiden A staying in Inazuma as acting Raiden Shogun to help stave off the Abyss. The Kitsune Saigu's prediction ends up being correct, and the Abyss does in fact invade. And while the Abyss doesn't win, not by a long shot, they didn't go down without a fight, landing a few notable picks in the fighting. Takamine the Mansplitter is driven away after being overwhelmed. Mikoshi Chiyo is vored by a beast of sin and left traumatized by how many layers of awful that might entail. And Kitsune Saigu is consumed by dark forces, corroding her consciousness into filth, and the remaining uncorroded parts of her mind forming into Kazari, who we see in the Yogo cleansing quest. Chiyo, corrupted and traumatized, turns her blade on A, which is unbelievably stupid because A absolutely slaps at combat and immediately destroys Chiyo on a one-on-one, and is driven away, tarnishing the Makoshi name. After this battle is done and won, A figures that she still has time to race over to Conria and help her sister and the other Archons dick on humanity for being a little bit too good at the whole freedom and humanity thing, because seeing 3 of her friends die was hard on her and she really needed to let off some steam. What she didn't expect to see when she got there, however, was humanity putting up a good fight. Such a good fight, in fact, that they killed A's sister right in front of her. A carries on the fight. Kanuya is destroyed, and A returns home and takes up the role of Raiden Shogun, the Electro Archon, without anybody knowing that Makoto died except for Yae. In fear of both Celestia and their powers, as well as erosion, A attempts to lock herself in her plane of euthymia, allowing a puppet to act on her behalf. Before she could do this, however, she needed to actually make the puppet. Her alpha build of this puppet, which took the form of a male vessel, decided that while his creation was a great thing and that he was glad his mother made him, that having a gnosis was a little bit too much work and decided to just embark out. A seals off his powers and dumps him on some random street corner somewhere in Teyvat and goes home to start on a second iteration of the puppet. The final puppet, which A simply names the Shogun, is told all she needs to know about her mission and her creator and sent to rule Inazuma. A then retreats into her plane of euthymia where she can meditate for as long as possible to stave off mental erosion. She tops this retreat off by giving her gnosis to Yae Miko. So a bunch of other stuff happens with characters I don't really care about that much, but I'll give a brief rundown of the stuff that's important. These guys named the Yogo 3 part ways. Asase Hibiki going to Serai Island to the Asase Shrine. Haranosuke, a guy we actually see in game through Kitsune flashbacks, goes to Liyue, and Mikoshi Nagamasa tries to repair the Mikoshi name. So remember that random ass dude that got corrupted by the Abyss, like Takamine the Mansplitter? Well, somehow he claws his way back up to Teyvat from the Abyss and actually encounters Asase Hibiki, a person he once knew or something. I don't know. Apparently Takamine scared Hibiki enough because she immediately kills Takamine. It's kind of funny. Then that Ako Domeki guy that Hibiki joined, the guy living on Serai Island, tries to overthrow the shogunate for some reason, because that always ends well. Hibiki decides to help with this rebellion because apparently she decides that he actually reminds her of the Takamine guy she literally just killed. I don't understand this character in the slightest. But yeah, Hibiki also uses magic or something to release seals that were placed on Serai Island or something. What those seals were, I genuinely have no idea. And for some reason, that angers a Thunderbird, which was there at this point for some reason, whose power causes the huge electrostorms that we have to fix in-game during the Serai Island questline. Yeah, blame the major historical figure for that time sink that quest was. This fury causes the Shogunate to take initiative and evacuate everybody off Serai Island, moving them to the nearby Narukami Island. They are able to live as they did before, just on a different island from before. Although the shrine in which they worshipped on Serai Island was left relatively untouched, but people abandoned it anyway, leaving only Neko, the talking cat, and the other cats there by themselves. Around this time, a guy named Iwakura Doke develops the Iwakura art, a sword style that becomes a signature technique for the Kujo clan, which rewards Iwakura with the title Doin. After this development, a bunch of automaton puppets are created, and their fighting style is modeled after the Doin fighting style. These puppets are what would later become the Magu Kenki. For some reason, and it's not really explained why, Iwakura actually fights one of these Magu Kenki, and I can only imagine how absolutely anime that fight ended up being, and he ends up winning, promptly taking his prize, a decommissioned war machine, and disappearing into the night. But the ship that Iwakura used to transport the dude crashes into the Golden Apple Archipelago, and while the sailors there escape the island, they forgot to take the puppet with them, leaving it there to be fought by a random person over and over again in a 6-week period before proceeding to sink in the ocean, never to be seen again. Yeah, I'm salty about it being a limited time area. What about it? Really, there's only one more interesting thing that happens in the timeline that's worth covering. At some point, the first of A's puppet finally reawakens on that street corner she dumped him at, extremely dazed and confused. All he has is a feather, and that's it. He doesn't even have an identity. He doesn't even have a name. He just kind of existed and didn't really know why. So he just set out to wander Inazuma, trying to figure out what was going on and who he was, probably only speaking the word empty or something. He eventually runs across a group in Tatatsuna who take him in, calling him names like the Wanderer, Wandering Eccentric, and Nameless Eccentric. Eventually, the Wanderer decides he was fed up with their crap and decides to leave, which causes the group to fight amongst each other due to one of the members committing some malfeasance without the Wanderer's presence. People fight, some guys die. Then the Wanderer and one of the members of the group get into a fight, which is just unfair from the start because, you know, he's the puppet of the Raiden Shogun. And then the Wanderer left Inazuma to wander the rest of Teyvat. Eventually, he found his way into Snezhnaya, where he met up with the Fatui and agreed to join the Fatui Harbingers. They then give him the name Scaramouche. So, now that I'm done with that, I can move on to Sumeru. I've been enjoying Sumeru a lot, way more than I enjoyed Inazuma. So once I finish this video, I will immediately start covering the extremely confusing and convoluted history of Sumeru. As I'm recording this, it is before 3.2, so there are probably major revelations that I'm missing here. So I'm going to wait for the Archon quest in Sumeru to finish up before actually covering it in its entirety. So yeah, that's my plan. And then I have been working on a secret project in the background. It is currently 18,000 words. So I'm getting close to finishing that. So that might be next. And it will be on this channel. I cannot bring myself to putting that on the second channel. So keep an eye out for a multi-hour breakdown of a game that isn't Genshin Impact. So yeah, that's about all I have for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. I swear it'll be sooner. Bye-bye.